For 2,000 years, the cheese on your ancestors' table was made with a flower, a wild yellow flower that grew in the meadow behind the house. You picked it by hand, dropped it into a pail of warm milk, and the milk thickened into curd. The English even named the flower after the job. They called it cheese rennet. Then, in 1874, a pharmacist in Copenhagen bottled something cheaper and steadier, and within 2 generations, the flower was forgotten. Almost everywhere. Because in one corner of Europe, it is still against the law to make that cheese any other way. Welcome to nature's lost vault. Long before refrigerators, before grocery stores, before anyone had ever heard the word pasteurized, people across Europe faced the same problem every single day. Milk does not keep. Leave it out and it sours within hours. But there was a trick, older than written history. Add the right substance to fresh milk, and it separates into solid white curd and thin yellow whey. Press the curd, salt it, let it age in a cool cellar, and you have cheese. Food that lasts the whole winter. The entire craft rests on one question. What do you put in the milk to make it turn? For most of history, the common answer came from inside a young animal. A piece of the stomach lining of a calf, a lamb, or a kid, dried and dropped into the milk. It works because that stomach holds an enzyme that curdles milk, the very same enzyme that lets a nursing animal digest its mother's milk. The Romans knew this. A farmer and writer named Columella, born in Spain in the 1st century, wrote it down in a 12-volume work on agriculture. Milk, he said, should usually be curdled with rennet from a lamb or a kid. But Columella did not stop there. In the same passage, he listed what to use when you had no animal rennet at all. The flower of the wild thistle, the seeds of the safflower, and the milky liquid that runs from a fig branch when you cut it while it is still green. Think about that for a second. 2,000 years ago, a Roman farmer wrote down that you could make cheese from a thistle and a fig tree. And he wrote it not as a curiosity, but as ordinary, everyday knowledge. The fig trick was older still. 300 years before Columella, the Greek thinkers Aristotle and Hippocrates both described it. Aristotle left the clearest account. Greek cheesemakers would stretch a piece of wool across a wooden frame, drip the white sap of a fig branch through the wool, and then rinse that wool in warm milk to pass the curdling power along. That is one of the oldest cheese recipes ever written down anywhere on Earth, and it does not involve a single animal. Further north, in the cool, wet meadows of Britain and Scandinavia, the job fell to that yellow flower from the beginning of this story. Botanists call it Galium verum. The old country names tell you exactly what people did with it. Cheese rennet, cheese running, curdwort. Kieslip, an old word that simply means rennet. Even its scientific name hides the secret in plain sight. Gallium comes from the Greek word gala, which literally means milk. You would know the plant if you saw it, low and feathery, with a froth of tiny golden flowers and the warm smell of fresh hay when it dries. It grew along roadsides and field edges across the whole of Europe. And for centuries, English dairies used it to make some of the famous cheeses in the world. In Cheshire and in Gloucester, the flowers of this plant did 2 jobs at once. They curdled the milk, and the yellow pigment in the petals tinted the finished cheese a deep, rich gold. That warm orange color you picture in a wedge of double Gloucester. It began as the color of a wildflower. Much later, dairies swapped the flower for a commercial dye made from a tropical seed. But the original gold came from a weed in the hedgerow. And here is what surprises people most. This was never some fringe practice or peasant shortcut. It was the standard, across whole regions. In Spain and Portugal, the coagulant of choice was the cardoon, a tall purple thistle and a close cousin of the artichoke. Cheesemakers dried its flowers, pulled out the slender purple threads at the center, and soaked them in water to draw out the curdling enzyme. No animal, no factory, just a thistle from the hillside. Historians believe the thistle method may have begun in Iberia, with Jewish cheesemakers in particular. There was a hard reason for that. Jewish dietary law forbids mixing meat with milk, and animal rennet comes from the stomach of a slaughtered animal. A thistle solved the problem completely. You could make a cheese that broke no rule at all. For thousands of years, this was simply how cheese was made. Animal rennet in some places, plant rennet in others. Every region with its own method, passed from parent to child. Then one man changed all of it. He was not maliciously trying to erase anything. He was simply trying to solve a small, stubborn problem. And the fix seemed minor at the time. It was not. His name was Christian Hansen, a Danish pharmacist working at the University of Copenhagen in the 1860s. Here was the problem Hansen set out to solve. Animal rennet, the calf stomach kind, was wildly inconsistent. One batch would curdle milk beautifully. The next would barely work at all. For a farmhouse making one wheel at a time, that was livable. But the dairy industry was entering the factory age, and a factory cannot run on a coagulant that behaves differently every week. In 1870, Hansen worked out how to extract a pure, consistent rennet from calf stomachs. In 1874, he opened a small factory in Copenhagen and began selling it. It was the first standardized commercial rennet in the world. Every bottle worked the same way every time. For a working cheesemaker, that kind of reliability was close to magic. And that is where the old plant methods quietly began to fade. Not through a government ban, not through a scandal or a raid, through something much harder to fight. Convenience. Why spend an afternoon gathering and drying flowers, never quite sure how strong your batch would turn out, when you could buy a small bottle that worked perfectly and cost almost nothing? Within a generation, the creameries switched. Within 2, the knowledge stopped being handed down. The flower in the meadow was still there. People just stopped reaching for it. But here is the part most people never hear. The plant methods did not actually die. In Portugal, they never gave them up. Some of the most prized cheeses in the entire country are still made the old way, and not out of nostalgia or charm. By law. Serra da Estrela is the oldest traditional cheese in Portugal, made in the mountains since at least Roman times. To legally carry its protected name, it must be curdled with the dried flower of the cardoon thistle. No animal rennet is allowed. The same holds for the cheese called azeito, and for torta del casar, just across the border in Spain. These are not museum pieces sitting behind glass. They are sold in shops right now, some of them so soft you eat them with a spoon. And everyone was set with a thistle flower, exactly as Columella described in the 1st century. And in a handful of villages in Greece, older cheesemakers still curdle their milk with the yellow bedstraw flower, the very same plant the English called cheese rennet. The thread was never fully cut. It just narrowed down to almost nothing. There is a reason this knowledge refused to disappear completely. It was never complicated, and it still works. If you live across much of the northern United States, that yellow flower from the opening is probably growing somewhere near you right now. It was carried over from Europe long ago and naturalized across Canada and the northern states. You will find it in dry meadows, along sandy roadsides, and near the coast. A low plant with whirls of narrow leaves and clouds of tiny 4-petaled yellow flowers that smell faintly of honey and hay in the middle of summer. The traditional method was almost embarrassingly simple. Gather the flowering tops. Steep or crush them into milk you have warmed gently, the way a farmhouse dairy would. The enzyme in the plant slowly draws the milk together into a soft curd, tinged faintly gold. Cooks in Tuscany, in Cheshire, and on the Scottish Islands did this for hundreds of years. It is a piece of living food history to recognize and enjoy, more than a remedy to lean on. It is a strange thing to lose. Not banned, not burned, not locked away in a vault by anyone. Just set down and never picked back up, because something in a bottle was easier. 2,000 years of knowledge, running all the way from Aristotle to a Roman farmer to your own great-grandmother's dairy, thinned down to a few protected cheese and a handful of old hands in Greek villages. But the flour never left. It is still out there in the meadow behind the house, golden and feathery and smelling of hay, doing the quiet thing it has always done, waiting for someone to remember what it was for. The next time you pass a patch of small yellow flowers on a summer roadside, look a little closer. You may be looking at the way the world made cheese for 2,000 years. If you want to keep recovering knowledge like this, the kind that almost slipped away for good, subscribe and stay with the vault. There is far more still waiting to be remembered.